Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Isabelle Chaudry, who is a lawyer and senior policy manager at National Women's Health Network in Washington, D.C. Today, we are talking on a bunch of topics: historically marginalized communities, access to health care, the Johnson & Johnson talc case, COVID and its effects on minority communities, the vaccine, and much, much more. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing a lawyer who is remarkable in what she has accomplished thus far. Her name is Isabelle Chaudry, and she is Senior Policy Manager at National Women's Health Network, where she is responsible in Washington, D.C., by the way, where she is responsible for developing and leading their women's health and consumer safety policy efforts, with a particular focus on historically marginalized communities. Isabelle lobbies at the grassroots and federal level on women's health and cosmetics policy, and has provided expert testimony before Congress and the Food and Drug Administration. She's done some really remarkable work, and we actually met because she also serves as board member for Women's Voices of the Earth, which is a great nonprofit organization. And we met there when we were doing a fundraiser online. So I met her and I thought she was fabulous. I couldn't wait to talk to her more about the work she's doing. So Isabelle, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this show.
Thank you for having me, Ailey.
My pleasure. So there's so much I want to ask you, but I think I want to start by just kind of framing who you are and how you came to get to this position, which is really cool, actually. So just let me know about your training and your schooling, and kind of what led you to the work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, I am a Bison. So for those who know, I'm a Howard University graduate. I went to Howard undergrad and Howard Law School. And I really started an interest in public policy in undergrad through interning in the Senate and just being exposed to the legislative process and working with the Senate Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions Committee. So I always sort of had a general interest in public policy, not specifically focused on any particular issue area. But as I matriculated through undergrad and then law school, I sort of started to hone in on certain areas, and in particular, labor, employment, and health. As well as education. So actually everything. So I started my career as a labor lawyer working for one of the largest labor unions in the United States, the National Education Association. I was in their affiliate office in Pennsylvania. So I started my career really engaged in representing and advocating for teachers and really understanding and going through the whole process of policy in terms of education and labor. And then I pivoted to health policy. And so that's how I ended up at the National Women's Health Network. And I've been there for over a year, about a year and a half now. And I was just really excited to jump in and start doing the work on cosmetic policy. Hair discrimination is something that really drew me to the work because of a lot of the issues that Black girls have with hair discriminatory policies in the school setting, as well as just Black women having hair discrimination or dealing with hair discrimination in the workplace. So that really drew me to the position and the general policy area of cosmetics. And
that's actually really, I was just going to say that when I was reading up on your background, and you do a wonderful blog for the National Women's Health Network's site, which I found a lot of really interesting information. But when you were, part of this blog that described this new policy, so that apparently that women's hair, Black women's hair, some of the people in this audience may not understand what those issues are. It's interesting. Like, it kind of struck me like, that more women are being told about policies within major groups, major businesses, national businesses like UPS. Tell me a little bit about, and the audience, about that, because I don't think many people consciously, or at least maybe ethnically Caucasian women, don't really think about there's being a policy on hair, right? Or
Right.
skin or spatial hair even too, right?
Right, indeed. The human right to wear one's hair is actually not protected for Black women and girls. So, this lack of protection is really harmful, and it's rooted in historically racist practices of controlling Black women's bodies. Black women and girls have been forced to adjust and chemically alter their hair and change their natural hair in order to conform to workplace and school policies that prioritize Eurocentric beauty norms. And this has been the case for decades. It's an international problem, it happens abroad. And the Crown Act is one way of addressing this issue at the federal level. There are also state laws that have been implemented around this issue. But federally, Congress the House passed the Crown Act, I believe earlier this year. And the act would end hair discrimination in the workplace and in school settings. And I think this is very much needed for Black women and girls to be able to really wear their natural hair in the state that it grows, in the form that they like, and the style that they like, and really just be able to express themselves, be themselves in these settings that are really fundamental to one's ability to really prosper in society, right? Because we're talking about the school setting where you're receiving an education, and then also in the workplace where you are making a living for yourself.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, like I said, I'm not sure if people often think about hair as being something that's discriminatory. And bringing that to light is really important. And the Crown Act actually stands for creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. So I think even that is an interesting name for legislation, because it's really getting to the point. And so much, and I'm sure this is probably maybe part of why you went into health as well, is that there are so many health related discriminatory activities in the marketplace as well, in terms of marketing to African Americans as well, in terms of the quality, or I should say that the harm of many of the ingredients that are in women's products, particularly aimed at Black women. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, in terms of the products, the studies are finding that products marketed to Black women tend to have higher concentration of harmful chemicals. And then Black women also use more products than other groups. We spend more money on hair products in particular, as well as intimate care products. And this is related to, again, beauty standards rooted in racism. It's rooted in, or it's a result of just this unrealistic expectation and standard of beauty that's placed upon everyone globally. That's just not realistic. And so studies are finding that the products that are typically marketed and sold to Black women tend to have more endocrine disrupting chemicals in the products, more harsh chemicals in the products. Um, and then Black women are using these products at higher rates. So it's a multi-layered issue.
You know, I teach high school classes on environmental health, and in some college, and I'm trying to get this as a national curriculum into high schools. And I think a big component needs to be, you know, African American products, and, you know, the disparity in marketing and ingredient testing, and the whole nine yards. And I went into one of the local schools here in Princeton, New Jersey, and I gave a general class on cosmetics to a group of young girls. And there were two African American young girls in there. And I had just literally for the first time gone to a big box store and walked through the aisles. And for the first time I met an African American woman in the aisle. And I said to her, she was looking for products. I said, could you do me a favor? Could you teach me and tell me which products the young girls use? Like, what do the high school girls use, and which ones do they love, and which ones do they kind of love, and what are the old and the new? And she gave me this whole tutorial in the middle of like this department store, right? So I got some products that she recommended, and I looked them up on EWG slash is ewg.org slash skin deep, which is a really good database for looking up toxicities and ingredients in products. And I brought it into the school, and I when I handed out products for the girls to download the app and to go through their products, I was a little nervous, but I put the products, in front of the two African American girls, Black girls, that's sitting there, and they're looking at it, and they're like kind of shocked because it was like something that they knew. And it was so cute. One of them they were all looking up their products, but she was so excited to not only know that her product was safe according to the database, but that she was thought of, and that there was something. I think she was surprised that there was that product in that room with all these other girls, and they were, of course, outnumbered in terms of the class. In this private school in New Jersey, right? So there was a little bit of a numbers game there, but I just felt really good about it. I just felt really good about it because I want African American young women, amongst all women, to be empowered to know what they're putting on their bodies, in their bodies, and to really understand, since they have a lifelong of product use and cosmetic use, they got to get it right. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
That's a very great story. Yeah, thank you. And I think, like you said, that is powerful to see, to have seen her reaction to her product, being rated by the Environmental Working Group. They're a really great group, and I always advise folks to check out the Skin Deep database when they're, uncertain about a product.
Yeah, I'm glad that they have such a selection. Obviously they're socially conscious, and they're understanding the need and the desire to know that kind of data and information for products. So we're on the same page. We both agree that's a good place to go when you want to look up your products. ewg.org/skin deep, and it's a really well vetted nonprofit that does good work. I was looking through some of the studies on your blog, which was an excellent commentary. The Black Women's Health Study, which surveyed 59,000 premenopausal Black women, found that chemicals in hair relaxers appeared to impact Black women's risk of developing fibroids. And then certainly the literature is pretty robust on many of those endocrine disrupting products aimed at younger girls or younger African American women that tend to shift onset of puberty and the onset of periods to a younger and younger age. So, and even more so than white young girls. And then it extends, I guess, even into hair dyes with new research that came back out just as recent as 2019,
Right.
that showed that any hair straightener or any hair dye actually increases the risk of developing breast cancer in an ethnic study. It was an ethnic comparative study between Black and white women. And so, what are your thoughts on that? Because it just seems really remarkable that we don't have any regulation on these chemicals, especially the ones in certain ethnic groups.
Yeah, we've been pushing for regulation, and thankfully, last year, Congress decided to act on this issue. And so, with the introduction of the Cosmetic Safety and Enhancement Act, we're hoping that the bill will provide more protection for consumers. But in addition to that, I think it's really important that consumers, women, Black women in particular, really research the products that they're using and understand the risks that are associated with the different chemicals that are in these products and how it may impact various reproductive issues and health issues to them.
Yeah, and that's interesting how the Crown Act kind of intersects with the issues with chemical policy, because now you're saying, we shouldn't be judged for our hair and how we use it. In fact, by not judging and opening up those policies without any discrimination, you're also allowing women to have, more safety, more health, reduce their risk of developing a whole host of health issues. So that's kind of interesting. So I'm glad that you're doing that work and you're part of that work. Tell me a little bit about some of the cases that you have felt in this world that you're working in that have had any particular, power to your mission. Anything that's related to the work that you really love.
Yeah, well, I'll stick to the broad aspect of
Yeah.
this because we're an advocacy organization, so we don't really directly engage with the victims as much, but we know that there are thousands of cases pending against Johnson & Johnson for another issue in the cosmetic world, which is talc. And so this company had known for years that their product had contained trace amounts of asbestos and continued to market and target Black women with these products. And Black women have been affected by this. There are thousands of women who have contracted ovarian cancer and are dealing and have died and are dealing with this issue. And so thousands and thousands and thousands of cases that are pending right now, and the victims that are going through litigation and the victims that have passed away from this issue is what really sort of hits home for me. And this is a product that was marketed in the Black community for years. And it's a part of many of our self-care routines, right? So when we think about self-care and the different products that we use, it's not uncommon for Black women to use baby powder. So I mean, I'm thinking about the number of cases and how this company has continued to just sell the product.
Knowing the health risks that apparently they did know about. And actually, just to step back a little, because I actually had to figure this out. Talc is basically a natural mineral that absorbs moisture, which is why it's used in baby powders, especially in the general area and feminine care products. But it's also used in cosmetics, right, to take moisture out as well. And when it's mined to pull the talc out of the ground, it's very close to where asbestos actually sits. That's how the contamination happens, is the asbestos gets in with the talc, and there's no oversight as to how much is allowed in those products or how much can be on a human body, what size that body is, what parts of the body that talc will go, even if it's contaminated. And asbestos is hazardous, and it's a known carcinogen, as we know from lung diseases that are from asbestos-laden insulation. And that was something that's been continuously battled in courts as well, in terms of mesothelioma and asbestos-related lung disease. So really interesting stuff. And so, what was your role in some of this work? In terms of your ability to kind of move the needle forward?
So I like to think that the role we have played has been big, because Johnson & Johnson announced in May that they would discontinue selling new talc baby powder products in the US, although they plan to continue to sell those products abroad, which will continue to impact Black and Brown communities. So in many ways, I think that we have been able to highlight this issue and really bring more awareness to the general public about the dangers of talc. And I was a participant in the FDA hearing on testing methods for talc back in, it feels like 2 years ago now, back in February. So we have played a major role in bringing awareness to the issues of talc and trying to hold the government accountable and making sure that the safety around talc is adequate.
Yeah, and at this point, they don't have an upper limit of normal for exposure. And in fact, it reminds me actually of a little bit about lead in cosmetics and cadmium in lipstick, for instance. You can have some of the most expensive lipsticks with the brightest colors, and yet because there may be only a teeny tiny amount of lead or mercury or cadmium found in samples of expensive or even cheap lipsticks, because it's not considered enough of an exposure per use, even though we all know we eat our lipstick. I mean, women have been, it's like 5 pounds a year, it's estimated, if you use lipstick that you actually consume with your food and licking it off. But there's no upper limit or lower limit of safety or upper limit of safety in terms of exposure. And so it's just one of those egregious issues that we face with our the US regulatory system, where no cosmetics are tested or required required testing by manufacturing before they go into the products that we put on our skin, intravaginally, feminine care products on our children. So it's pretty shocking. And when, I heard you talk about this at that Women's Voices meeting, it was really, quite alarming to me. And do you have a personal connection to the talc issue and the Johnson & Johnson issue?
In some ways, I mean, I've used the product. I
Yeah.
grew up using the product. Fortunately, um, at times we would switch between the talc and the cornstarch
Yeah.
option and other powders,
Yeah.
but I grew up using um, talc-based powders in makeup, in baby powder. So I definitely have a personal connection.
Yeah. I grew up with it too. I mean, it's, that's a name brand that basically everyone kind of relates to babies and safety. And so it's kind of alarming. But yeah, and it's also probably put in a lot of men's products too, which I don't think people think about in terms of foot powders and, anything that absorbs moisture, it's part of those products in many ways. So it's quite pervasive. So Isabelle, tell me a little bit about the upcoming vaccine that's being rolled out throughout the country. Historically, new medications, testing, trials have been a difficult sell in the African American population for good reason, because there's been historically problematic connection to science and scientific study that has not been transparent. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that and how you think, or your thoughts on African Americans receiving the vaccine and how it should be messaged.
Yeah, so the FDA issued the emergency use authorization for Pfizer and the COVID vaccine this week. And, when I was watching the critical care nurse, who was one of the first people in New York or one of the first persons in New York to get the vaccine, I was sort of like, I don't know. It was interesting to watch because yes, Black and Brown communities do hesitate to participate in clinical trials and hesitate to sort of participate in these processes due to their significant levels of distrust in the medical system. And they have all reason to, right? Because we know about the historical victimization in the medical experiments, from the history of sterilization practices on Black bodies, including the Tuskegee experiment, and distrust in the clinical trials. So it was interesting to see, this Black woman receiving the vaccine, and I know that there was reason for the images and, having that person really be at the front and center with this. But I think it's really important that governments really be as transparent and ethical as possible throughout this process, right? Because if we're thinking about forced sterilization, which is one of the reasons why Black people are very hesitant, it's not been long since the last issue with forced sterilization, right?
Give me the
Um,
time. Give the audience the time frame as much historically as you can share, because I would assume that most of us, or not maybe most of us, but some of us in the audience don't know the historical problems in terms of distrust of the medical community.
well, I didn't want to go too far back, but just as recent as, this summer that we heard about the um, forced hysterectomies that were going on in the ICE detention facilities, right? That it came up in the news cycle and it sort of just disappeared. I think it was in September, right? News broke that doctors were performing hysterectomies without informed consent on immigrants at the um, Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. So,
Were they the holding centers for the immigrants, or were they actually prisons, or what was that exactly? That location?
so it was the ICE Irwin County Detention
Right,
Center,
right.
right? And so this this is a huge issue, and this was just in September. And so examples um, of these kind of practices where women had been forcibly sterilized have been going on for, like I said, centuries, right? So I'm thinking about Dr. Marion Sims, who's considered the father of modern gynecology. He developed and perfected his surgical techniques by conducting deadly experiments on enslaved Black women without their consent or anesthesia. In Puerto Rico, women, it was in the 1930s and 1970s, women were subjects for initial trials of oral contraceptive pills without their knowledge. And this drug experimentation was happening to sort of like develop the birth control pill.
Hmm.
Um, we know that as well, this was happening, instances of forced sterilization was happening in Los Angeles County at the USC Medical Center on Mexican women. And so fertility control measures, um, forced sterilization, reproductive abuse and violence are are the multiple reasons why I think a lot of people, Black and Brown communities in particular, fear, participating in vaccine trials and even getting the vaccine, and they have all right to.
So I just want to ask this question. Given your education, I wanted you to just expand on how you, came to learn all of these historical, like you just said, you had just said to me off of recording. Tell me a little bit about what the influence was on understanding the historical value and the historical issues that go along with experimentation on African American women. Where did you learn this? Where did it most affect you, and how did it change you?
Um, I would say a lot. I learned a lot more going to Howard University. So taking courses in Africana studies, and learning more about, or going deeper into some of the horrid practices um, that colonization um, and the U.S. has had on my community and on the global Black community. Um, I think it having that experience has deepened my analysis and my perspective. So it's kind of hard to not, um, to not include a historical perspective or a critical race analysis of some sort in the work that I do. It almost happens by default. Um, and then of course I do a lot of research, and I make sure to include that kind of perspective and that kind of analysis in my work. So some of it is from going to an HBCU, and some of it is, building on the fact that I went to an HBCU and continuing to do the study and continuing to incorporate those studies into my work.
I was just thinking about my medical school education and how, we might have touched on a few of topics, but it was never really a required course to have, topics like environmental justice or, differences in ethnicities across the board in terms of medical care, medical access. I think that in modern day, I kind of wish, and I don't know if this exists, whether or not there's courses that are or mandated curriculum that really teaches, medical students and healthcare providers about these disparities and how much more beneficial it would be, I think, as practicing physicians, to kind of know that history, and then also what the issues are moving forward, because the vaccine issue is a real time issue, right? We want to make sure people don't die, and it's going to be one of those situations where the communication is going to be critical. And actually, this morning, I think it was the Surgeon General in the U.S., Dr. Jerome Adams, just got his COVID vaccine this morning, sitting next to Vice President Pence. And so there's something, I'm not sure if it feels posed. I think it's appropriate. He's our Surgeon General. But I think it's important to have, myself, I like to see who the health and wellness doctors that I associate with, the ones that are skeptical about medications, who are skeptical about pharma, what are their thoughts? Because a lot of this has to do with the science of the actual vaccine and the
Yeah.
data. And I think we need to judge perhaps individually every bit of science and data regarding every individual decision, not kind of make it a whole blanket statement about all vaccines, perhaps, or all medications. So anyway, I'm hopeful. What are your are you hopeful? Number one, I would imagine that you're thinking we're going to pull out of this COVID-19. It's the topic of every subject that we talk about on some level. What are your thoughts moving forward in terms of the changes that maybe this brought about in terms of awareness?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I COVID feels like it it's been years. It started in March, well, the restrictions started in March. But I am very hopeful that we come out of this and that the healthcare industry and government really, really engages in ethical practices in delivering the vaccine and, getting people back to health and being transparent about the process and these issues.
Well said. I want to thank Isabelle Chaudry, who again is Senior Policy Manager for the National Women's Health Network and a lawyer and a woman battler on the fields of women's health and all sorts of things that encompass you, because you are really something else. So I appreciate you so much for being on our show. And your full bio is actually going to be with the show itself. So please, everyone, take a look at what work she's been doing, and also the blogs on the National Women's Health Network, which I believe is nwhn.org.
Yes.
How can anyone reach you or follow you, or is that the best way to reach you? Is to kind of look at through the blogs and reach you through the organization?
So yes, my Twitter profile is Isabelle Chaudry.
Okay,
Yep.
spelled Isabelle Chaudry.
Yes.
I actually Isabelle.
Yes.
Chaudry, Chaudry.
Yes.
So be sure to follow Isabelle on Twitter and all her social media and her blogs, which are really fantastic. So
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for being here and being part of the show and sharing all your knowledge. I really appreciate it. And I wish you the best of health and happiness in 2021.
Thank you, Ailey.